The Post Newspaper Podcast, your community news.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for coming back to the podcast. My special guest today is James Gardner with the Your History, Your Story podcast. James, good to have you on.
I'm glad to be on, Richard. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty good. You know, I don't know if you've been following the weather down in the south part of the country, but we've hit a pretty good cold streak coming down here. It went from say 70s yesterday to 20s today, so it's quite the shock.
Well, I can't feel too badly for you because it was 7 degrees here this morning in New Jersey, and even my dog didn't want to go out.
That's pretty bad. So, so James, I came across your podcast on social media through a mutual friend. You interviewed J.R. Shaw down here, who podcasts in Galveston, and I thought I want to have James come on and tell us about his podcast. So let's start there. How did you get into podcasting to begin with? Were you a journalist by trade or no?
No, not at all, actually. I was in finance for my entire career for about 40 years, and I retired in 2019, right before COVID. And after that time, I was retired. I did some substitute teaching, but my wife and I, before that, while I was working in our free time, we used to go around to, say, seniors communities, historical societies, libraries, and things like that. And I would give talks on usually American history because it was always a passion of mine. It was my undergraduate degree, and we had a lot of fun doing that. But late in my career, right before I retired, my company had me relocate to Connecticut, so the commute was really exhausting, and we stopped doing that. But when COVID hit, when we were in together, and I was retired, so what did we do? We spoke to a couple of friends who were very inspirational to us. They said, you should take what you used to do, going to different places and give talks, and do it on a podcast. So we didn't really know anything about podcasts at all. I knew there were podcasts. I'd listened to a couple, but I didn't know much about them. Certainly had no idea how to produce one. So we actually, Kelly, my wife Kelly, and I, who we do the podcast together, we talked about what that might look like, what kind of stories we would do. And it was actually in October of 2020, we released our first episode, and we've been doing those episodes ever since. So it was a it was a big learning curve on a couple of fronts. One, the technical end. My wife Kelly, she really dug down on that and learned it. I give her a lot of credit. But I also had to learn to listen to my own voice, and I didn't much like it. And I was nervous when people came on at first. How do I get a good story from somebody? But after time, I just started to just love doing it. And it's been a real ride now for 4.5 years. We've been having a great time.
That's awesome. So let's unpack a couple of things you just said. One that comes to mind, getting used to hearing your own voice. Now, as someone who did radio for 4 years, that really helped me out a lot. And it was so interesting to hear yourself played back on a podcast or a recording or something like that. And it's like, it doesn't even sound like me. And I did some research myself, and there's some science behind that with the echo chambers in your ear and when you're talking, the vibrations and all that. And you don't hear that coming back. How did you make the adjustments to, um, I guess, any adjustment you may have made to your voice to tweak it to make it sound more presentable to yourself and to others? And how did you deal with just getting used to the two different sounds, one in your head and one being playing back on when you're listening to your podcasts?
Now, that's an interesting question, actually. Well, one of the things is that Kelly has told me on occasion that I can mumble.
Okay.
So the mumbling where I would kind of trail off on my voice at the end of sentences, I had to learn to sort of pick it up a little bit and keep it more steady. The definite difference in sounds between, as you said, between what you hear in your own ear and what you hear on the recording. I think it took probably about 3 episodes until they sort of met in the middle.
Right.
And now I sort of sound in my own head like I do on the recording. Did that happen to you by any chance?
It did. It did. It took a little bit to get used to it.
Yeah,
I,
I think so.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. In my own ears, even right now, of course, having headphones is something I've started doing a lot more. Especially with headphones, you're trapping so much noise in your head, and you sound deeper with
Mm.
through your headphones than you do when you're listening to it played back. Your voice can sound really thin if you're not careful on the playback, as opposed to what you hear in your head. At least in my experience.
Exactly. And the other thing is, in the early episodes, I listen to them once in a while, and my sounds very nervous in the beginning, and
Hmm.
I could tell that. And it took a little while before I calmed down and said, "Hey, wait, this is an interesting story. Pretend I'm having coffee with this person right now." And it changed it a lot. And I thought, hey, I'm learning, and our listeners just have a seat in the theater to hear me learn from my guest.
Right. How many episodes have you done, James?
Actually, we looked at them this morning. We had a total of 140 episodes right now, and we had some specials. We did some shorts and things like that, but it's approximately 140 episodes.
And so, how long did it take you to get completely comfortable with the whole process, or are you there yet?
uh, that's funny. I would say that I am most of the way there. And when I say that is that I think as far as preparing for my guests, I definitely have a system down pat, and the whole thing is about preparing. If there's a book to read, that the person's an author, that I've read the book or substantially gone through it and researched it, that I have maybe listened or watched a few YouTubes that person has done before with another podcaster. That gets me comfortable with how that person's body language works, and are they a more serious person? Do they like to laugh or things like that? I think in that way that I'm much more comfortable, but I still get nervous when Kelly and I do the final edits and stuff. I do a introduction, and the introduction is sort of a summary of the whole thing, what the person can expect. And I think I used to agonize over that, and I still do to some extent to get it right. So, but I think we're getting down on that as well. We're trying to make it more, um, where it just sort of entices the person to listen as opposed to giving this big drawn out summary of what they're going to hear because they're going to hear it anyway, right?
Right. No, you're
Yeah.
right about that.
Mm.
Yeah. How has the podcast evolved? I know in my own situation, I look back at my early podcast for various subjects that I do podcasts on, and I look at it where I'm at now, and I just think, my gosh, and it's incremental tweaks. It's not just I just reinvented it one day after, say, episode 5, but I can see the incremental tweaks. How has yours evolved over time?
Oh, in a few ways. So, Kelly, with her editing process, I think in the beginning you're worried about a lot of ums and ahs or hesitations and things like that. And you think, oh no, it's got to be perfect. It's got to be perfect. But you can sometimes over edit because people do say and people do say ah, and there are pauses because that's what we are. We're human, right? We gather our thoughts. So to not be so focused on that, to sort of let up on the gas a little bit. But I think having Kelly was she's my best critic and she's my best supporter because she'll say, you have to be having fun. And I think the more I was having fun with my guests, the more relaxed I was, and the more I naturally thought of questions to ask and follow-ups. So I think it was more about relaxing and being prepared. And I think as we went on, I got even more prepared. Like I started using like listening to other podcasts and uh, even podcasts that weren't involving the guest I was going to be interviewing, just to watch other interviewers and what they do and how they say it and what I think works and what doesn't. So as time went on, I started to learn the whole interview process and how it goes.
What were some of the best advice that you picked up from some of the podcasts, or maybe from people in general? Okay.
Well, actually, my son-in-law had given me some advice early on. He said that it can't always be the guest that people are listening to. The podcast, you have to be the podcast, meaning me. And I thought to myself, yeah, but it's the guest who's interesting. It's the guest who drives it. And he said, no, he said, you have to actually uh, be part of the reason somebody listens to your show. Because you could go on and find that same guest interviewed by six other people, seven other people. So what do you, meaning me, what do you bring to it? So he suggested that I get more involved without, taking away from the guest, but bringing more of the guest out because of my style, not just relying on the guest story.
Hmm.
That make sense?
It does, absolutely. And if you're not careful and you're just really just trying to relate to guests, you can, I guess, project your own story on top of theirs. And before long, you're kind of comparing notes, which I think sometimes that's okay, but you just don't want to do it too much.
No, no, not at all. And occasionally I'll interact with part of my own family history, but it's always how it relates to what the guest is talking about. And then I'm very conscious about backing off and then, listening to what the guest has to say, but trying to add something that the guest maybe hadn't thought of, or, a question or a hypothetical situation. I try to throw things like that to make the guest sometimes pause and say, no, I hadn't thought of that. And that means that no other interviewer has thought of it either, you
Hmm.
know. So I try to bring something new to the table if I
Right.
can.
How much scripting goes into your prep? Do you base your podcast on a script as far as I've got 8 questions I'm going to ask you, or do you start it off with one or two icebreakers, kind of some general things, points of discussion, and just let it flow naturally?
That's a good question. Yeah, the way I started it off, I had it much more scripted. I had usually a list of six or seven things on an outline. In the beginning, I was actually offering up to the guest that I would send them the outline so they could be ready for it. And then I started to realize that it was taking away from the podcast the spontaneity of it. And I actually had some of the more experienced guests, experienced in interviewing or in being an interviewee, is that they preferred not having any prep, that they would just sort of say it as it is when it comes. And I learned that. And so now I just have a few ideas written down next to me that I want to make sure I cover, but they're not specific. They're just general questions. Just so that I'm sort of following a guideline so I don't forget something, but I don't have anything scripted as far as full questions written out or anything like that. They're more like memory joggers for me.
Hmm. If you could explain your podcast in a couple of sentences for people who've never tuned in before, don't know anything about it prior to tuning into this podcast, how would you describe it, James?
Helping people to tell stories, generally speaking. That's very general, but it's either their story personally, story about somebody in their family tree, or some event or subject that has fascinated them that they want to talk about. And that's how it goes. Or it could be a cause, something near and dear to their heart, a disease or a challenge that they have had or other people have. That brings up another thing with Kelly and I because we do this together. We Kelly does all the technical end of it. I do all the interviewing. I do all the prep work for the interviews, but we both come up with the ideas and the research to find guests. So you'll see a blend, you'll see a wide variety of guests. If you see the ones that are related to presidential descendants, military history, stuff like that, that's probably coming from me. If it's human interest, Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, organ donation, things like that, that's more coming from Kelly. But we both really put our hearts into the final product because they're all very important topics.
Right. Well, speaking of some of those topics, now some of those topics I can just imagine when you flesh those out with your guests and they're sharing anecdotes and stories, personal stories, that could evoke some emotion. That can evoke you're hearing trials and tribulations of another person. Any average person could could respond to that. How do you maintain this straight face, do what you're there to do without, I guess, getting tied up into that emotional, I guess, aspect of that interview? Or have some of those interviews maybe made you emotional inside?
They've there's definitely been several episodes that have really gotten me. There was one initially early on in the process. We decided we were going to look at our own families. How do we start it? How do we start this off? If we're going to ask other people to talk about their story, let's talk about ours. Well, my wife Kelly, her uncle died when she was 14 years old. She was very fond of him. He was a single man who dedicated all his free time to teaching scouts and young men how to kayak and canoe competitively.
Hmm.
This was back in the 60s and early 70s. We were able to find three men in their, I think, late 60s now, who were his campers basically back in the day. And we interviewed the three of them. And Kelly and I and the three gentlemen were all emotional talking about these memories of Kelly's uncle because it brought him to life to me. I never met the man, but he was very important to my wife, so he was important to me, and that brought out a lot of emotion, as it is right now for me.
Hmm.
But we've had several guests pause to gather themselves because they were talking about something that had affected them very personally, and it moved me. But I tried to keep a sort of not a straight face, but to be concerned because I am concerned, but to try to rein in so I don't lose it because then I'll get a frog in my throat and then I'll blow the whole thing to pieces.
That's true. Podcasting in general gives a voice, in my opinion, gives a voice to people who otherwise wouldn't really have one. I mean, if you went back 15 or 20 years ago, the stories you're talking about, if a local TV network or newspaper didn't pick up these stories and decide to run them, those stories would never get out past maybe that individual circle of friends or family. Talk about
Mhm.
how you've seen your podcast make a positive impact on other people that you've interviewed.
Wow, that's great. Uh, as you know, here we are in 2025. There are very, very few World War II veterans still living. Now, both my parents were veterans. They're both gone for many, many years. But usually on Memorial Day or D-Day anniversary, you would have a little clip on the news or something where they interviewed a World War II veteran for a couple minutes or a minute, just a little clip. Well, I've sat down with two over 100-year-old pilots from World War II for an hour-long interview each, where they shared all kinds of memories. I just don't I just don't think that would have happened 10, 15 years ago, except maybe some people had a recorder and did a little oral history project for school, but where it's something that could not only be recorded but played or accessible by a lot of people. I think that was important to us because historically these are voices that are so important to hear what they had to say, what they experienced, and now we've been able to put them out there for people to hear forever, really,
Mhm.
That was a big thing, I think, for us in that area. And we've also spoken to other people who are quite elderly who have great stories to tell. Sometimes seniors, older people, I'm one now, are hesitant about telling stories, or people don't think to ask them, or they're afraid, or they don't have the time. I ought to ask grandpa, I ought to ask grandma. But here's something where someone's sitting down with me for the sole purpose of telling their story, and it's just great to be a part of that. I hope that answers your question.
It does. It does. The podcasts that we release, I mean, we put the finishing touches on them when they're done. We try to make them as presentable as possible, but sometimes they just don't go to plan. There's an interview, this was way before podcasting when I was writing for the paper, which I still do, write for a couple of newspapers. And I was told about an interview, a potential interview with a man that was a Holocaust survivor that lived in a local town where we're at. He was in a nursing home. and but he was still available to communicate. You know, he could still communicate his stories, pretty lucid. I went down there and recorded that interview, and I came home, and for whatever reason, that interview was not there. It was an hour-long interview with this gentleman, and he passed away 2 weeks later, so I couldn't go back and get the
Oh,
interview again. That one sticks in my mind as one of the ones that's really made me try to be really, really, really cognizant of equipment and making sure everything's working as best it can. Have you lost interviews? Have you had one that just didn't quite go the way you thought it should go? Technically speaking.
yeah. First of all, just so you don't feel bad about that, think of, I believe there was a photographer landing at, I think it was Omaha Beach, who was t took like rolls and rolls of film on D-Day, and it ended up that somebody in the developing room in London afterward exposed all the photographs to the sunlight or the daylight and ruined all of them. So you imagine how awful that person felt. So yes, we had a couple. One was it just the sound just was not good. We did it. It was a live in person, not live. It was an in-person interview, and it was a great topic. But when we listened to it, when we got back to the studio, it just wasn't good. It wasn't clear. We couldn't hear the person. So I said to Kelly, I got to call them and say, can we do it again? And that's
Hmm.
tough. You never want to do that. You never want to do that. But he was very understanding. And he said, look, he goes, we want it good. Let's do it good, a good one. So we did it. And we did have another occasion where I feel the guest was very nervous and was maybe overly prepared.
Hmm.
So they sort of started running with it without me asking questions. So it got away from me a little bit. And it's kind of stopped it, I believe, before we were done and say, I think we're going to have to reschedule this one because the way I phrase it is I want it to be the best of you telling this story.
Hmm.
And that's kind of the way. So there were those two incidents where we had that. We also have redundant systems in our recording. If it's Zoom, we've got it recording on Zoom. We've also got an SD card, running through the Roadcaster so that we have a backup in case. But so we do that sort of make sure. But if the actual interview itself, something goes wrong, you just have it wrong in two places. You
You
know,
know, James, sometimes I've had to redo a podcast on Zoom, and like you say, it's hard to go hat in hand back to that person and say, "Hey, I got to do it again." But I just kind of play it off and say, "Hey, just treat the first one as a rehearsal." Okay,
mm,
now we're both rehearsed, and honestly, I think the second interviews I think the second interviews went better than the first.
yes.
we were
Yeah.
we were more comfortable with each other and all the rest of it. Um, Talking to you, I guess it's been a couple of weeks ago when we were setting up the podcast. We were talking about obviously a little bit about the podcast itself, but also we got into the subject of faith. And I know you're a religious person, and I am as well. Um, how does faith play into your podcast? I know it's not necessarily a religious podcast, but anyone that's a person of faith is going to have some of that presence in everything they do. How does it affect what you're doing with your storytelling?
Yeah, good question. I think when we started this podcast, Kelly and I prayed that we would honor God through this podcast some way, that we would honor God. And I think the way that we figured we would do that was to really respect the people we were interviewing, never try to get any gotcha moments or to become, hot button issue things where we're getting people angry or anything like that. We'll respect the fact that everybody has a cherished story or interest. So I think that was the main thing is we would treat people well, kindly, and that they're important to us and their story is important. And I think, staying off things that are, purposely unpleasant or just get people riled up to get more listens or likes or whatever, we weren't going to do that. And we just wanted to honor people's stories. And I think that's the best way. Now, we have had several people on our show who are definitely people of faith, and their stories involve their faith, which is fantastic. But there's people from a wide variety of backgrounds and faiths and things like that we interview, but we respect them all.
Okay. What have I know all the podcasts that you do have piqued your interest in one way or another, or you wouldn't be interviewing them in the first place. But which ones really stand out? If you could put two or three, I don't want to put you on the spot and say which ones do you think are the best, James, but I'll phrase it this way. Which ones do you think had the most meaningful impact on you as a person?
Wow. That's tough. I think one of the earlier ones that we did was there was a the idea of interviewing her came before we even had the podcast.
Hmm.
And I was looking up The Wizard of Oz because I had this thought that if I ever did a podcast, I'd like to interview, is there anybody alive who's a descendant of anybody? And I found I was looking for somebody related to the Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah.
And I wasn't able to contact anybody. But then I found a woman by the name of Betty Ann Bruno. And she was at the time was like 89 years old. And I found her on Facebook and she lived in California, but she taught hula. She was
Okay.
almost 90 years old. Reached out to her on Facebook and I got back about 3 months later a message from her husband saying that, hello, I know you reached out and we started talking. Anyway, she was one of our earlier guests on the show. She was one of the Munchkins on The Wizard of Oz.
Hmm.
He was one of the probably about two, maybe a dozen children who sort of filled out the Munchkins on the set. Well, she was the loveliest lady. Turns out she was in media for years after her childhood acting career, and she just was such an amazing person. And we ended up meeting her and her husband here. They came to New Jersey to visit some family, and we just developed a friendship that to she just recently passed and I'd been in touch with her like 3 or 4 days before she passed, and she's just a friend. Even she's passed, but she's just a friend that we made. I'd say I mentioned to you about there was a pilot, Lucky Luckadoo. We're still in touch. He's 102. He's going to be 103 next month. They really impacted me because of their zest for life. And because I'm in my 60s, these people were quite a bit older than I am. And yet, man, they're they were still at it, doing what they love. She was doing hula dancing. He's going around giving talks and things about World War II. He's traveling all over talking about his comrades and things like that. It just built up this enormous amount of uh, hope for my years to come that I can be vital and interested in others and helping others.
So I watched a couple of podcasts last night, James, on your channel, and I noticed a lot of them are in a studio setting. Now, how many of your podcasts are in a studio setting as opposed to maybe Zoom interviews like what you and I are doing?
The vast majority are Zoom interviews. Vast majority. We have only done, I want to say, two or three where we did a studio interview. We actually went to a studio. And then we did one actually, no, I'm sorry. We did one on location, two on location, one in our home studio here, and then I think two or three we did at an outside studio. But the vast majority of them are Zoom. We did do a few on the phone. Sometimes when you interview people who are like me, they're maybe not as technically savvy and they don't have a trustworthy assistant to get us on. They'll say, I only do the phone, and then we'll do a phone interview, and that's fine. It's a little harder. You may find, I'm sure you probably experience the same thing. It's a little harder if you can't see the person because you don't see the body language.
Right.
So that's it.
Yeah, and that reminds me a little bit of radio, and radio is that whole theater of the mind type thing. And I don't know about you, but I found if I'm interviewing someone on a phone where it's an audio only podcast, I think my questions change and I think my descriptions change just a little bit because I'm trying to keep in my mind that the person listening to this podcast, as you say, can't see it. So maybe
Mm.
I don't know, I guess are a little bit more descriptive Have you found that?
Yeah, I've found that. Now we are planning on, we're in the process of moving to video.
Hmm.
So we've gotten some of the hardware and some of the software. We're just we've sort of gotten stalled a little on the training to get us up and going on our own. So we're hoping to convert it so that you'll basically see the Zoom screen for those interviews while you're listening. But I tend to think when I listen to a podcast, it's almost always when I'm walking the dog or I'm in the car. I'm usually not looking at like YouTube, that I'm listening. But a lot of people just they really want to see it or be able to see it. So I think it's important that we move in that direction.
Hmm. Equipment. You talked earlier about having a roadcaster, so I know you've got a good. Of course, for people who don't know what that is, that's basically an interface where you tie stuff in and mics and all the rest of it. What's your current setup, James?
Not much more than that. We've got our laptop here. We've got the Rodecaster. We've got a couple of really good mics. I think the mics are a very important part. You probably know that. The headphones are good quality. We picked up a couple of boom arms. Initially, we had them, the mics were on these stands and it was awkward. We kept knocking them over and it wasn't good. So we were at a podcast expo down in Florida a couple of years ago, and they had these boom arms. And Kelly said, "We got to pick these up." And man, are they fantastic! You just move them around on your table. You don't have to worry about knocking them over or anything like that. And then we have you know, a larger screen that Kelly does all the editing on.
Hmm.
So I'm speaking to you on a smaller screen, but the larger screen she does all the editing on. And
Hmm.
that's really what we use.
Okay. And so, podcast production for people who may be watching this who are already podcasters, we're always looking for tips and suggestions and stuff like that. From the time you end an interview, James, to the time you publish it, how many hours would you and Kelly have put into that?
So you mean when we're done with the interview? The
When you're done
interview,
with the interview.
oh, well, I'm going to say, I'm going to tell you what the process is. Kelly goes through she listens right through it, but she listens with an editor's ear. So she's listening to making sure that if there's any disruptions in the Zoom connection or there's a long gap or somebody's coughs or their dog barks and they got to walk away for a minute, she'll take care of all that. And then that could take her, I'm probably grossly underestimated. It could take her at least 2 or 3 full concentrating hours on it because she may run it through a couple times. Then when she's done with that, I do a full listen myself. And I'm listening more for the content with regard to, does it make sense? Is it flowing okay? Is there something in it that um, sort of went off in left field or whatever, and that be better to either sort of take it out or whatever. Of course, never ever changing anything anybody says, but sometimes it'll go off in you know, on a tangent maybe or whatever, where you figure, hey, let's tighten it up a little bit like that. So I kind of last minute haircut and to maybe get it down a little bit, and then to make sure we're still on target. And then at that point, Kelly does all the uploads and we get it ready for our release, which is usually at 12:01 a.m. on Mondays, twice a month.
Okay. Okay. So you do yours twice a month. I was going to ask. You beat me to it. I was going to ask you that next. How often it's distributed? Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Well, we started once a week, and that was burying us. It was just too much.
It's a
It was an
lot.
overreach. It really was. But because you want it to be good, you want the guest to be very happy with what they get. Because we
Hmm.
always send the links to the guests so they can listen, and we want them to be happy with it. We want our listeners to be happy with it. And then we have a secret ingredient. We have a special ingredient with our podcast. I have a lifelong friend who lives in Europe, and for the last almost 4 years, he listens to the episode and gives us a full review before we're even awake in the morning. And he has done it, and he's very honest. A couple times he caught a problem where there was a problem with it that where it didn't come up properly or whatever. So we have that little secret weapon helping us out. I'll tell you, it's so valuable. And he even apologizes to me if he's not able to listen to it right away. I said, you don't have to do that, but we love it, you know?
Right. It's good to have that extra ear. We can
Yeah.
get so engrossed in our own projects, and after you've done them for a while, maybe you built the confidence up, but sometimes having someone completely from the outside looking in is a good tool.
It really is. And you want somebody to be honest with you because if somebody says, oh, oh, it was good,
Mhm.
that doesn't help. If they say it was good because this, or I think it could have been better because of that, that's more helpful, isn't it?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's what
That's
you
true.
want. You really do. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, James, at this stage, a lot of people do podcasts because they start off with an interest, but then later on they pick up a lot of traction, and the next thing you know, they're able to monetize it. They've got sponsors, and it you hear all these success stories of it turning into maybe a part-time or full-time career. What's the trajectory for your podcast? What are those goals there for you?
Oh, well, we have these discussions all the time. And I think if we are retired, we would love to monetize it. We are having an absolute blast meeting the people we've been able to meet. And we've made a bunch of friends through our guests and having fun. We get a lot of publishers contact us and they'll send us a media copy of books. So I've got great books that I've been able to read and learn. But the fact that we're moving to video, even though there's a little expenditure involved there, we think that this is getting us more up to date. And then we're going to be looking for some sponsors to see if we can monetize this and get more listeners and maybe a little more aggressive with our advertising and getting it out there and doing some more shorts where we promote ourselves on social media, little mini interviews on sites of different places, and getting people to know that we're out there looking for stories for them. You
Hmm.
know, so yeah, we would like to monetize it, and we would. I think that would just give us some sort of sense that this is part of what we do now because we have our lives. I mean, we're retired, but still, our family comes first, and we've got five grandchildren, and our health is very important. We've started going to the gym. We have to put other things in front of the podcast for sure, but it is kind of like a job. But as long as we're having fun, we're going to keep doing it. If we're doing it out of obligation or we just got to do another podcast. Then we wouldn't. There's no reason to keep doing it if we don't love it.
No, you're right about that. It definitely can take over your life if you're not careful. Um, Suggestions to anyone who may have an interest in starting a podcast for the first time, or maybe they've had one before and it wasn't all that great, but they're thinking about doing it again. There's that yearning inside. What would be a couple of pieces of advice you'd give them, James?
Yeah, first of all, if you're not a super techie person, I would recommend you get a couple of either Gen X or Gen Z people who speak the language, shall we say, to give you some tips on how to get started. Just some lessons. If you get them involved early before you buy. It's like don't go out and buy the best tennis racket in the world when you've never taken a lesson. You want to find out from an expert what kind of equipment you should get for a starter. Get some advice in that area. Start listening to other podcasts, particularly podcasts that are in your area of interest. If you're a political person, you want to go to political podcasts. If you want to do history, look at history. Listen to all areas. There was one podcaster who was pretty well known, and I reached out to her, said, "I'm just starting. Would you be able to talk to me and give me some advice?" She actually sent me a message and said, "I'd be pleased to talk to you."
Hmm.
And she gave me some tips and how she felt about it like 2 or 3 years in and so get some advice from the podcasters and also tech people to get started. And then just start watching and listening. But you better really love it if you plan on seriously doing it because otherwise it won't last long.
Hmm.
You
Oh,
know, I
that's the
can't,
truth.
yeah, I don't know if you know any of the statistics, but I had heard one time, I think there's a pretty high rate of dropping off after just a few episodes.
Hmm.
So having done 140 or whatever, uh, that it seems like we're doing pretty well. We've had experiences we'd never had before. We met people. We've visited our guests. We just had lunch yesterday with a Pulitzer Prize winning Civil War historian who was a guest on our show. Who gets to do that unless you're doing this podcast, you know?
Yeah. Yeah,
Just
no, you're right
fun,
about
you
that.
know?
Opens up a lot of opportunities for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Uh, well, very good. Well, James, I think we're going to end it there. I'm definitely going to link your YouTube channel into the description of this podcast. I hope the next maybe before long, when I'm watching your podcast, I see that little YouTube plaque in the back where you've reached 100,000 subscribers. I know that there's milestones between here and there, but I hope one day you reach that and you're really successful with your podcast.
Thank you, Richard, so much. Thanks for reaching out and keep doing what you do. Okay.
All right.
And it's been an absolute pleasure. And now you're in the Houston area, right?
I am south of Houston, about 18 miles. Yeah.
Yeah, I conclude by saying so. J.R. Shaw is somebody we both know, and
Yes.
J.R. we met at a podcast expo down in Florida, which I mentioned before, and he did a tremendous episode on the Galveston hurricane of 1900. So I advise people to go find that at Your History, Your Story, because J.R. did a wonderful job. He was a great storyteller.
Hmm. He sure is. He's a great guy. I've gotten to know him pretty well. I've interviewed him a couple of times, and he's building a good following. And it just goes to show if you have a message that resonates with people, you're going to build a following.
Absolutely.
Thanks again, James.
Richard, thank you very much and have a great day.
You too.
If you enjoyed this video, consider supporting our effort to share the news in print and on our extensive website, and now on our new YouTube channel. Contact publisher David Day at area code 409-943-4265 to support the Post newspaper today.